Welcome to this week's episode of Practice What You Teach. Holly, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a master's level psychologist here in Charlotte, and I'm in private practice. I work with kids, teens, and adults in therapy, and then I also provide psychological evaluations. So for things like educational related issues, whether it's ADHD, learning disabilities, giftedness. So that's another piece of my work that I enjoy.
Yeah, it seems like it's an interesting balance of doing some of those those evaluations and the therapy piece rather than kind of just one or the other.
Yeah, it's nice to kind of have a variety, different people, different clientele, and a variety of therapy clients as well as evaluation. So it's fun to mix it up.
Yeah. So how did you come into this field? Like how did you know that this was your calling?
Yeah, so I am really a relational people person just by nature. So I'm pretty extroverted. I love to be social. I love hearing about people's stories, their lives. So really starting from high school, that AP Psych class really got my wheels turning of, oh, this is really interesting. I can learn about myself. I can learn about others, relationships. So then kind of continuing on into college, took some psychology elective courses, really fell in love with it at that point. So I decided that a career, whether it was in the field of as a psychologist or a counselor, kind of figured out what's the difference between social work and marriage and family therapy and counseling. So I landed in the field of psychology, really love the assessment piece of that, which allows me to do that here as a psychologist in North Carolina.
Yeah, very exciting. Very exciting. So on the therapy side of things, do you specialize in anything? Is there anything that you do there?
Yeah, my framework that I really align the most with is acceptance and commitment therapy. So that's known as ACT, the abbreviation there, and really love that model. It's so different than your traditional CBT or other therapies. So it's kind of on the newer side of things, and I've really enjoyed using that framework with most of my clients.
Yeah, it's really cool. My background being in DBT, there's certainly components of that kind of mixed in with
Yeah.
kind of what I do, but yeah, it is it's really helpful. There's a lot of tools in there that can be just even just kind of like in day-to-day life, really useful. So
Definitely.
that leads me to kind of the big question, right? Like maybe it's an ACT skill, maybe it's something else, but what is the tool that you use yourself that you feel like has been the most helpful in your own life?
Yeah, so there are six main parts of ACT. It's called the hexaflex. So there's mindfulness and self as context and committed action and values. But the one that I want to focus on, kind of thinking about what did I want to talk about in relation to ACT today, is a tool called Defusion. So it's Defusion, Defusion. And that is one of my favorite tools from ACT because it's so different than maybe what we were taught in grad school about CBT and how we stop our thoughts and let's replace them and let's change them.
Mm.
Defusion takes a whole different perspective, and really acceptance and commitment therapy has
Yeah.
a different perspective on that.
So what is diffusion? What does that mean?
Yes. So diffusion, the goal is to really separate our thoughts from our actual experience, right? So it's not to change the thought, but it's to change the function of the thought and the relationships with our thoughts. So what I like to really fondly call it is unhooking, right? So a lot of times we become really fused and really attached to a certain thought or to a certain belief. So much so that it's going to dictate what we do. It's kind of having that power over us, right? If I think, oh, well, I'm not really a social person, it
Mhm.
may lead me to, if I'm really fused or hooked by that thought, I'm not going to introduce myself, or I'm not going to ask someone if they want to come out to dinner with me because I'm hooked to that thought. And so diffusion is really a tool that helps us create space for all kinds of thoughts without letting it dictate our behavior. And I can still choose to do or make an action that is toward my value, despite having a thought that may say the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's certainly, in DBT, I kind of talk with clients about kind of this, like, having mindfulness of our thoughts, that we experience them, but they aren't us and they don't define us. And, they're just kind of something that comes in and eventually something that goes, because we've never had a thought that has stayed in our brain forever.
Right.
We have thoughts that are frequent flyers and come back often, but there's never been one that's been permanent in our head for all of time. And so it sounds kind of similar to that, right? Where we're kind of just shifting our relationship with the thought rather than the thought itself, right?
Definitely. And, I talk with my clients very similarly about that, where, in our brain, we have neural pathways, and some of those pathways are really well paved. We know the road. And if we've been having a thought that kind of pops up, even for 10, 15 years, that road is really well paved. And so how do we allow ourselves to let's create a gravel road, something that's less paved, but we're really retraining our brain to be able to make space for other thoughts and using that in a non-judgmental way.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're using this yourself, right? Because I mean, even with DBT skills, I'm using these myself on a regular basis. And so when you're using this ACT diffusion tool yourself, what does that actually look like? Like,
yes,
can you kind of describe that for us?
Definitely. So I have a list here of different ways that one can use diffusion, and that I use diffusion as well. Some you may gravitate more towards just based on your personality. But the first one is when you're having a thought that you're really hooked on, saying it maybe 10 times fast, right? So maybe the thought is, I'm not a social person, or I'm a failure, or something that really has that emotional tug at you. There are a lot of thoughts that we find to be neutral or that don't really have an effect on us. But then there are some thoughts that really, they get to us. And so if we say that 10 times, have you ever said something so much that it's just kind of like,
yep.
And it kind of loses its meaning over time. And the goal of this is to really understand that truly our thoughts are a bunch of vowels and consonants kind of mixed together. And our thoughts are not facts. They're really not. So even singing it to the tune of Mary Had a Little Lamb or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, it kind of adds some levity, some humor to it. So we don't take it as seriously. We can kind of better unhook.
Yeah.
Another way would be to preface our thought with the words, I'm having the thought that. So for example, going back to I'm a failure, there's a difference between I'm a failure and I'm having the thought that I'm a failure, right? That kind of adds a little bit of distance, a little bit of space. We don't really say that as much as a fact when we're prefacing. And being able to use the humor again, right? There we go. Thank you, mind, for that thought, right? Here's that paved pathway that kind of keeps on keeping on over the years, and being able to kind of use some humor and levity of, there's that thought again.
Yeah. 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 Right. Really being able to name that it is just a thought.
Exactly. And one other tool that I like to use is an arm raising exercise. So I will have my client, if they're sitting across from me, I'll say, what I want you to do is I want you to say, I cannot raise my arm. And then I'll ask them to raise their hand, raise their arm. And so they're saying, I can't raise my arm, and they're raising their arm. So it's a very physical example of showing we can have all kinds of thoughts, but that doesn't mean that that's the reality of the situation.
Right. Kind of a way of kind of challenging that a little bit. But so with some of these different strategies, like, can you give us an example of maybe a time recently where like you used one of these things and you feel like it worked for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's so interesting what comes up when the therapist, you're using this tool with your clients, but then you're able to really say, how can I apply this to myself? And I use diffusion all the time because we're human too. We're people too. And so we have thoughts that we can very easily get hooked by. So for me, using mindfulness is another great tool to really help anchor myself in the present moment. So I'll give you an example, even with this interview, right? So being able to come on and speak with you today about what diffusion is, I'm noticing the thought of, am I going to be able to articulate diffusion in an intellectual way? Am I going to be able to really sound articulate? And all of those thoughts that kind of creep in. And sometimes if we get hooked by those, that would have probably looked like, all right, Kimberly, I'm sorry, something came up. I can't come to your show today. I'm not able to record with you.
Yeah.
But being able to notice those and say, all right, I'm going to make space for that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. And also allowing myself to take an action that's toward my value, right? So my value is committed education and resources and connection and community. And so I'm allowed to have whatever thoughts or whatever mental experiences while also maybe making an action that says something different than what my thoughts are saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like it worked because you're here.
I'm here.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about how sometimes our thoughts can be really sneaky, and sometimes we might not necessarily, I know sometimes I might be so in the zone on something that I don't even really realize kind of the direction that my thoughts are going until it kind of reaches that point where I'm like, oh God, this is like too much, right? And not until I can kind of take that step back where I can really start to think about, okay, where's my brain at, and what strategies do I need to be using right now? And so I'm thinking about like what helps you to remember that diffusion is an option. What helps you to think like, oh, this is something that I can use this tool for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for myself and for my clients, making time each day to kind of do a small check-in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it may be that there are times in my day where I'll have a moment either between clients or after work or in the morning and just kind of taking a few deep breaths and checking in, is there anything on my mind right now? Is there anything that I'm aware of that I could be ruminating on or really, really heavily focused on? And is this something that I need to draw my attention to? Is there a need that needs to be met? And then noticing, okay, if that's happening, if I'm maybe becoming stuck on something or I'm noticing I'm becoming hooked, being able to incorporate these tools like mindfulness and diffusion. Sometimes it's also helpful to have an accountability partner, reach out to a friend. Hey, I'm really in my head about this right now. Or maybe you don't share about what's going on in your life right then. Maybe you call a friend and kind of have a distraction or turn on the TV and something's humorous or funny. So, I use the analogy a lot with my clients of the seesaw, right? So there's processing our emotions and feelings, and then there's distracting.
Yeah.
If we're only distracting, we're not even, if we're only processing all the time, we're also not balanced. So how do we find a balance between the two?
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, certainly, especially on the distraction side, right? If we are too heavy on that, we've definitely got some avoidance going on, which is part of the human experience. There's going to be things that we intentionally avoid, and then there's going to be things that we don't realize that we're avoiding until our attention is brought to it.
And there are some red flags that can kind of help us to identify if we're becoming stuck or really fused. So in working with clients, as well as being aware that we're doing it ourselves. So if we're using extreme or absolute statements like always or never or worse or best, if we are using really judgmental language, we're not really describing the event neutrally, but we're adding a lot of passion and judgment behind it.
Yep.
or if we're noticing that our mind is continuing to ruminate and perseverate on a particular topic. Those are some good indicators that we might need to work on some diffusion.
And it seems like it's helpful to kind of tune in, right? With kind of like what maybe are those red flags for you, because different ones might be more present for different people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some people may struggle more with that black and white thinking. Other people may distract and kind of camp out in distraction land. And so figuring out what happens when I'm really fused or when I need to unhook, and then being able to let that be your guide.
Yeah. So what happens when maybe you've been in a situation where you recognized you needed to diffuse, you were trying to diffuse, and like the intensity of the feelings just made it really complicated and it was really hard? Like, how do you troubleshoot maybe when it's not working as smoothly as we would like it to?
Yeah. And I think part of it is having self-compassion, right? So a lot of times, our brains are very efficient. And when we've been thinking a thought, and when it's really disturbing to us, or it's emotionally, pulling and drawing on and tugging on our heartstrings, it can be really hard to diffuse. And I tell myself this, I tell my clients this, using compassion, and we have to start flexing that muscle to be able to build the muscle. And so it may take 15, 20, 25, it may take 100 times of prefacing your thoughts, or using mindfulness, or doing the silly voice, or whatever way that you're trying to unhook. But being proud that you are making an attempt and an effort to do that, because that's training the brain a different neural pathway. We don't have to continue with what we've always done. So really, self-compassion is my biggest go-to when things don't seem to be really working in the direction that we want to instantly. It does take time.
For sure. For sure. And it is, yeah, I mean, certainly it is that muscle, that we have to strengthen. We're not going to start, if I'm going to start running, I'm not going to go run a marathon in one day, right? I got to work up to it. And this stuff is similar in that way. What do you feel like is your go-to strategy for self-compassion? Like, what does that look like for you to give self-compassion?
Yeah. So for self-compassion, for me, it's noticing, what does my future self need as well? So not necessarily what may feel good in the moment right now, but what is also going to be beneficial to me maybe tomorrow or maybe next week. So it could be, for me, not overscheduling, or going to bed an hour earlier, or really making time to be social with friends to recharge my battery. So I think being intentional, again, as I mentioned earlier, checking in, asking yourself, what do I need? And then making that resource available, asking for help if maybe you don't know what you need, and having a partner or a friend or, a colleague, anyone who you can kind of have that relationship with. I also really like to have, I have affirmation cards that I will use with myself and my clients. So I have these affirmation cards here. I have some coping skill cards. So keeping those materials kind of ever present. Also, if you're on social media like myself, I have follow other clinicians on Instagram, other positive, really helpful tools, reading materials, just kind of keeping those nearby so that if we need an extra dose of encouragement or healing, that's also kind of what we're also consuming, instead of all the other, like, maybe unhelpful stuff we're consuming throughout the week.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Part of it's right. Like really being intentional about, our sources of information, and especially on social media, just kind of being intentional about what's in our feed. And is it stuff that's filling us up, or is it stuff that's not?
Like kind of taking away or draining us.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, if people want to learn more about ACT, and especially with diffusion, how can they do that? Are there good resources out there?
Yeah, so there are tons of reading materials on ACT. The founder of ACT is Stephen Hayes, so he has lots of resources. There's also Russ Harris. There are tons of YouTube videos out there with metaphors. So one of the big tools in acceptance and commitment therapy is the use of metaphors to really make it relatable to us as humans. So there's a great metaphor for diffusion. It's called the sushi train metaphor. So it has to do with sushi on a conveyor belt, being able to notice our thoughts and how they relate to sushi. So there's a plug for that if you want to go check that out, and lots of other great tools online. So I would definitely recommend Russ Harris and Stephen Hayes.
Yeah, and we'll put some links to those things in the video description. So if anybody wants to check them out, feel free. And if
Yes.
people want to find you, Holly, how can they contact you?
Absolutely. The best way to get in touch with me is through email. It's holly@carolinapsychologycenter.com. And I'm happy to share more about ACT. And if anyone wants to ask questions or connect, please do.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed talking about ACT today, and definitely thinking about, definitely some similarities with kind of the DBT mindfulness of current thoughts, and certainly a lot of the ACT things. And I think that's kind of one of the cool things when it comes to some of these therapy things, is that there is a lot of overlap. There is a lot of kind of influence, and
Yes.
and it's just, yeah, kind of finding what works for you, and so many different ways that it could be applied. So thank you for
Yeah.
chatting with me today about it. I'm really excited to learn more about diffusion and maybe some ways that I can use it myself.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. If you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel so you know when more are coming out, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.